Welcome to CapitolView, the weekly program about state politics and government and how it might just affect you. Joining me this week on a special Zoom meeting of CapitolView is Dave Dahl, State House reporter for WTAX Radio. Welcome, Dave.
Ascot and Pocket Square. I am impressed, Bruce. You've outdone yourself.
And as have you. And also Jerry Nowicki, Capitol Bureau Chief for Capitol News, Illinois. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Great. As we can all see, we are taking appropriate social distancing protocols in light of pandemic, and pleased to be back after a long time away. However, coronavirus still dominates the news, perhaps not as much as it once did, but it's all in everybody's mind. Most recently, Republicans have sued Governor Pritzker, saying, hey, all this is too much. We need to be allowed to have larger gatherings than we have been allowed to have under executive orders. And this is impinging on our ability to convene, to express our political viewpoints as a party. They are also pointing to, geez, the governor has been out with demonstrators and protesters and events in the wake of the tragedy in Minneapolis that resulted in the loss of life for George Floyd. They point to that and say the governor is allowed to do that, but we can't convene in any group larger than 10 right now to express our political views. What are we to make of this? Is this serious? Is this political? Is it a mix of both? Anybody have any ideas?
Before long, we're going to be in, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Dave.
Before long, we're going to be in phase 4. So what are you going to do? What kind of relief can there be?
Well, phase 4 allows for 50. Ask Donald Trump whether 50 is enough for him in Tulsa, where he wants to gather this weekend. So phase 4 brings us to 50. Right now we're at 10. And I believe that the lawsuit is saying you can't, even 50 might be restrictive, but your point well taken, Dave. We're scheduled to go, well, in just a few days now, cross fingers, to allowing indoor dining at bars and restaurants, as well as gatherings of 50 people. A political convention involves more than 50 people, I think.
Probably.
That lawsuit is about, to an extent, applying these laws, these rules fairly, because whatever you think about any of the protests, the fact that the governor is walking with hundreds of people seems to be you're picking and choosing which causes are allowed to be take part in whatever, and that seems to be the inconsistency with how it's being applied. So that's the crux of the lawsuit.
Sure.
How can you allow that and say other things aren't admissible, even though it's also they claim First Amendment speech?
No, I think that's a point well taken. How do you go elbow to elbow with folks, and good folks, these aren't bad folks at all, with folks to even if you're whether the cause is good, bad, or indifferent, depending on your political standpoint, it does seem a bit hypocritical. The governor is telling us all, I mean, as this show is showing, we all, I think, are taking this seriously. We're not gathering in a television studio where we're exercising our precautions. Look at you, look at me, Jerry. I mean, we haven't shaved in a while. We're afraid of barbers because the governor told us we should be. And here's the governor now saying, well, you know, there can be exceptions made. And there have been exceptions made. Church gatherings, for example, that was pretty clearly unconstitutional. That's what the weight of events seem to have shown. And so I don't know, this seems to me perhaps to be as much about scoring political points as making real progress.
That's what the governor's office said.
The GOP actually mentioned churches in the lawsuit as well. So, you know, it does seem that they're just trying to have the law applied evenly at this point too.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting. The governor's press office, in reaction, said that the executive orders have been upheld or have held strong. I don't know if that's necessarily true. There have been some executive orders that have been issued that have not been withheld or have been withdrawn. For example, excuse me, we had the issue with should folks be cited for misdemeanors who violate the order, and that lasted a couple 3 days. Not all of these executive orders have held up, and I kind of wonder going forward how enforceable are any of these things. How much of this depends on the goodwill and of people and public sentiment, as opposed to thou shalt from the governor's office.
Yeah, I think that's probably been the backbone of all of these orders is the willingness of the people to observe them. They were never really pulling people out of church and throwing them in squad cars. They
Yeah.
were just hoping the congregations don't gather.
Yeah, but there was one point at Easter services, a Springfield church wanted to have a drive-in service, and they got a pretty nasty letter from the authorities here in Springfield saying you're in violation, and it was CC'd to the Illinois State Police, to the sheriff's office, to the state's attorney, to local police. A kind of veiled way of saying if you do this, squad cars might show up. So that was back in Easter. We're a world away from there, but the church backed down, and then within weeks, the governor's office is in fact endorsing drive-in services. So things.
Drive-in movies too.
Well, there's. I haven't been to a drive-in movie in a long time. Perhaps Spartacus or might be a good one to see right now. Who knows? I wonder also about the breadth of this. When this all started out, the governor said you can't go boating. I mean, it would be illegal to go out and take my 12-foot aluminum rowboat out to Lake Springfield or any other lake for that matter and go trout fishing or bass fishing or whatever. And that seemed to catch a lot of people odd. More recently, just a few days ago, I believe, the governor said, nope, we can't have the World Trapshooting Championship down in Sparta, Illinois. It's been going on there for a number of years. And this has caused some consternation, I think, to the local populace. The organizers of the event submitted, I believe, a 40-page mitigation plan to the governor's office, to the state, saying, here's how we're going to enforce mitigation. There would be no spectators, apparently. I mean, talk about social distancing. These are folks with shotguns that stand some distance apart, and always have, to shoot at clay pigeons that are some distance away. And the governor's office said no. Is this an overreach? Is the governor's office overreach? And beyond that, is there some sort of split here? Because I think it might strike some folks that, well, the rules in Chicago are different than the rules downstate, and yet the governor goes to public events in the Chicago area where lots of people are around and then says you can't have a trap shooting competition downstate.
And when we have these conversations and debates, does that make us guilty of whataboutism? What about this? What about that?
I think you're right, Dave. There is and to some degree, I think it is. Whataboutism is sometimes hard to get away from, and I think we're talking about what the governor has done and the pandemic, because you can now go get a haircut. You can now go to a barber. Does that make it smart? I'm not sure that it does. And we're seeing, I think, in other areas, notably Arizona and Texas, a few other states, cases are on the rise. We're not over this, I don't think, by any stretch of anyone's imagination. And so we're going to move to phase 4 here within a week. And what happens then? It's hard. I think it's impossible, really, for most anybody to say.
We could get a spike.
We get a spike. Speaking of spikes, word just came in a few days ago that our Attorney General, Kwame Raoul, has tested positive for the virus.
I was going to mention that, Bruce, because not only does it have to do with the coronavirus story, it has to do with whataboutism. I interviewed him this week, the Attorney General, and the day our story ran, got an email from someone who said, you conveniently left out the fact that Mr. Raoul is at rallies, and what about the president? You report he goes to rallies and that they're dangerous. Well, number one, I don't. Number two, the Attorney General has underlying conditions, hypertension, and calcification of the arteries. He's also a cancer survivor. And also, his wife is an anesthesiologist. She could be bringing it home every day. So who knows where somebody got the coronavirus. I think there was some political gathering that was, in focus about 10 days ago, too. So the general said, I'm proof it's still out there. But I also got a little bit of the whataboutism on, you report on this, but you don't ask him about his rallies, blah, blah, blah. My response to that listener, by the way, was, okay, thanks.
Good response. Thanks.
Okay, thanks.
Well, yeah, there is a lot of whataboutism, and at least here, I've talked, the folks that are turning other folks in for violations of these orders aren't generally, I think, members of the public. They're competing business owners who say, I'm closed down. What about Billy Bob or Susie Q down the street who's still running, who's in violation, and really nothing's been done, I think, by and large. I think that the state has taken some limited action, but I haven't seen folks, the weight of the state closing down scofflaw businesses. And so,
well, I don't think the governor's that interested in doing that. I would think his executive orders are more like executive suggestions.
Yeah,
Well,
I think that's
yeah.
Go ahead, Jerry.
You mentioned that, we had discussed earlier, you got to have a buy-in from the people. Executive suggestions might be a thing. And philosophically, when you're trying to get people to follow those orders and appearing with elbow to elbow with hundreds of people, you're not going to have as much buy-in after you see the governor doing something like that, after you see Kwame Raoul up there elbow to elbow, regardless of the cause. There's going to be less buy-in because you see the people who are telling you this is so dangerous, putting themselves in harm's way for whatever the cause is.
Yeah. Speaking of hundreds of people being together, I'll see you all at the state. No, wait a minute. We won't see you at the state fair this year, either in Springfield or Daquan. I mean, both have been canceled, and that is surely going to have some effect. I'm not sure I believe that this World Trapshooting competition down in Sparta really generates $30 million, as some of its backers say. I did the math on that. With 5,000 attendees, that would be each person spent $6,000 down in the local economy. I think that might be a little inflated. The state fair, though, is a huge deal. I mean, clearly here in Springfield, and I presume also down further downstate in Daquan. How can the state economically and local economies survive a hit like the cancellation of the state fair? And this was something clearly that the governor had signaled quite some time ago, that there's probably not going to be a state fair. There's as much a chance of having the state fair as a game at Wrigley Field this year. But this week it became official. I think folks are very concerned. Was it necessary? I mean, in the scheme of things, could we have plausibly had a state fair of the size that it's usually been come August time?
I think with the coronavirus still being around, that's probably the way you would spread it across the state if you wanted to do something like that. I don't know. The decisions, only history is going to tell us whether it was a good or bad decision. Selfishly, I'll miss eating corn dogs for a week and calling it work, but it's just economically, as you pointed out, there's going to be just astronomical effects from not only the state fair, but all these conventions being canceled in Chicago. Everywhere else is losing big events, Trapshooting. I have no idea what these effects will be, but they're not going to be small.
There'll be a ripple effect, turnover, whatever. Now, the Republicans around Springfield, and I presume other places downstate, say the governor canceled the fair all by himself, didn't even consult us, didn't even get our input. Well, what input are they going to give? Governor, we need to have the state fair, and then the governor will say, I totally think differently about this. Yeah, let's do it. If you're going to cancel all the other stuff, I mean, I kind of wonder what took them so long. But some of the Republicans say maybe canceling's a good idea, but we should have had some input. And some of this can be done virtually.
Yeah.
Like what? What part of the state fair can be done, in a Zoom?
Well, you could maybe look at a butter cow. The butter cow's always been behind glass anyway. But
Yeah.
other than that, but the other aspect of this, I think, is the state fair. We're heading into an election year. There's always a lot of politicians around the state fair heading into an election. How might this? Yeah. Will anybody miss it? I mean, might the silver lining be? You know what? We don't really need all these politicians at the state fair. We could just eat corn dogs instead.
Yum.
It's been kind of, seems like it's been scaled back, some of the political activity at the fair. They still have the Governor's Day, I think, last year, and they had a GOP day, but it just hasn't, I don't know, it seems less and less lately.
A lot of it's been at the hotels.
Pardon me?
A lot of it's been at the hotels. They had the Speaker of the House last year for the Democrats.
Hmm? Yeah, I mean,
They had the Speaker of the House for the Democrats, Nancy Pelosi.
Mm-hmm.
She filled the ballroom at the Clown Plaza here.
Yeah, and so maybe this is this the nail in the coffin for gathering for large gatherings in the heat and humidity to listen to Republican Day and Governor's Day and Democratic Day and is this the end of something that was kind of on the wane anyway?
Well, I don't know. I mean, what do you compare the Illinois State Fair to? Indiana and Iowa, the state capitals there are, bigger cities. And, what's the area that you draw from? I mean, you're not going to stand on Michigan Avenue and say, you know what, we're going to go to the fair today. So I think, trying to plot the state fair on the spectrum of things, I've always found kind of difficult. I have fun there, but if you have, in fact, Kevin Gordon, who's manager, said in Springfield, you've got 115,000 state fair managers who think they know what the right idea is. I mean, if you bring on a bunch of new stuff, they say, wait, what about the things we've had every year? If you bring on no new stuff, it's the same every year. And then complaining about the grandstand acts too. I mean, it's like, summer sport here to second guess all that stuff.
Sure.
In terms of the political activity, there was the Democratic County Chairs Brunch has been very large in the last couple of years, but I think people like to stay in that air conditioning and then either go back, maybe stop at the fair briefly and go home. But it's at the Crown Plaza Hotel in Springfield, so it's sort of separate from the fair, but you could go as a follow-up act if you wanted to do that there. And I don't think they'll get rid of that County Chairs Brunch. Clearly, it's been a boon to the party in recent years. But in terms of the Republican Day last year, it was just one little room at the, I think it was the Wyndham, and it was half full, maybe. So.
Yeah, well, fair enough. Let's move on for a second and talk about the other issue that's come up, and it's been an issue for many years. But it's obviously risen to the forefront, and that's racial equality in the wake of George Floyd's killing in Minneapolis. Lots of consternation here. It did get the governor out of his foxhole, so to speak, in a way that he hasn't prior. I mean, he's been out a bit, but he's been out more, I think, since this happened. He was at a recent event in Springfield, talking to some organizers of Black Lives Matter demonstration here in the capital city. He's been at events in Chicago. There's been lots of talk. I think folks are looking for action. They're looking for something more than talk. What are we hearing? Are you folks here? You two? I mean, ear to the ground. I mean, I haven't seen much concrete surface about we need to ban chokeholds, for example. There's been talk about state licensing of police officers. We haven't seen a bill. What are you folks hearing about what might surface at the Capitol, and when, and what the chances might be?
We've been doing a podcast series at Capitol News Illinois where we've reached out to all of the members of the Legislative Black Caucus, and we've spoken to probably at least half of them at this point. And there's a wide-ranging number of things that they'd like to see. I don't know, I haven't read anything in a concrete bill, but for example, Senator Jacqueline Collins from the Oak Lawn area, Chicago area, she said she wants to really focus on bringing people to the table to talk about increasing opportunities for financing and for Black companies, for Black people, because it's always been, the big banks have been such a barrier to helping Black people build wealth in Illinois and the U.S. For such a long time. Representative LaShawn Ford has been arguing that the governor needs to sign an executive order recognizing a crisis in Black communities and sort of funneling more resources into them. And then other senators have said, you know, this needs to be more of a collective effort. Each of us need to get on the ground in our communities and organize and give each other hope in this effort. So that there's a number of proposals that I think we'll see: criminal justice reforms, bail reforms, minimum sentencing reforms. Some of those are already in bill form even before all this. But I don't, some of the lawmakers want a special session so we could get to this now before November, when we're scheduled to come back for lawmakers. But I don't know, yeah, maybe someone else has heard something else.
Well, I wonder.
Go ahead.
I wonder some things. I wonder if there's a way to do a chokehold that doesn't physically harm the person you're trying to restrain. And I would be cautious. And I tried to ask the governor this at the event with the organizers, and I didn't ask it in a very artful way, but to turn things over to non-experts to try to dictate how police are going to do their jobs, someone who probably hasn't even been on a ride-along. I mean, if you get all the way down to someone saying, well, when you shoot, aim for the wrists. How hard can it be? Just aim for the wrist. And when you get down to that, you know, that doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. The other thing I'm wondering, in the greater picture with George Floyd, is this going to be one that turns the tide? Are we really going to get something productive now? Or are we all going to be back here in 6 months talking about the next one?
No. Well, I was at the same event, Dave, and I had asked the governor. He had recently appointed 5 new members to the state law enforcement training and standards board. This is the entity which develops curriculum, so to speak, to train police officers. Especially now, it would seem like a pretty important aspect of policing. It would be the training. The board is currently headed by Brent Fisher. He's the executive director. He's been in some hot water for hiring Forrest Ashby, not hiring, giving him a contract at the behest of Mr. McLean, a Madigan confidant. And this was before the world changed. This was in, I believe, February, where GOP's folks were, you gave this guy a $60,000 contract because he's a political insider. And then suddenly we went on suspension. So I'd asked the governor about Brent Fisher. Does he have the he didn't necessarily answer the question. He didn't say yes, he didn't say no. But, you know, are we going to create brand new boards, or are we going to revise the ones that already exist? And so, and if you're going to do that, if you're going to appoint 5 new members, and that's I believe there's 18 members on the board totally. Most of them actually under the control of the governor through one way or another. For example, the head of the Department of Corrections is on the board. I'm thinking that, rightly or wrongly, maybe we should be paying some attention to exactly what that board is doing, and what training efforts they're making. For example, I mean, you rightly note, Dave, about chokeholds. It's one thing to talk about it in an academic sense, I guess, but I don't know how I'd feel if I was a cop and I'm in a life or death struggle, and it does happen. Do I use a chokehold, or do I, you know, and this is nothing about putting a knee on somebody's neck. That's completely different. but do you use a chokehold when you're fighting with somebody? And do you worry about that?
Well, and that Atlanta thing, there's some unanswered questions there too. It's certainly not exactly like the Minneapolis thing, where the guy supposedly pointed a taser at him, and did they know it was a taser? Did they want to get the taser out of his hand? On the other hand, the guy was shot in the back. So
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of unanswered questions in Atlanta that maybe people are jumping to conclusions are that factors that were there that were not there in Minneapolis. Apparently, it's okay to jump to conclusions there. And the other thing I wonder is these guys are fired just outright. Do they have a police union? Would this fly in Chicago? I would think that the union would be mounting a pretty strenuous defense regardless of who it is and what happened.
Well, without getting into the particulars about, yeah, they shot him in the back. That's never good. That's never good when you shoot someone in the back. Police unions, that's a great question. The police unions now have a tremendous amount of power, and we're running out of time, and so I'll have to wrap it up here quickly. But police unions have a lot of power, and can you somehow affect that power without also affecting the power of other public sector unions? And we are out of time, and so thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week on Capitol View.